journey of Abraham and Sarah. And tonight we're going to talk about the death of Sarah in Genesis 23. So verses 1 through 2 read, Sarah lived 127 years. Then she died in Kiriath Arba, that is Hebron, in the land of Canaan. I don't know why they can't just say that, right? It's Canaan, all right? Abraham went to mourn for Sarah and to weep for her. So there's some interesting things here. As far as I can see, Sarah was the only woman in the Bible where they took note of her age at her death. The only one that I'm aware of. And as you guys know now, or maybe you don't know from listening to me, I'm always in that vein of the Bible never just randomly says things, right? So there's usually a meaning behind what they say. So she was the only woman whose age was recorded at her death, and I think she was really honored among women. She's mentioned other times outside of this context in Isaiah 51, 1 through 2. It says, "Listen to me, you who pursue godliness, who seek the Lord. Look to the rock from which you were chiseled, at the quarry from which you were dug. Look at Abraham your father and Sarah who gave you birth. When I summoned him, he was a lone individual." So it's giving honor to both Abraham and Sarah. And God is mentioning Sarah there. And then the other scripture there is, where did I get to here? Oops. Is 1 Peter. Come on, Jamie. I'm not quick enough with my thumbs. 1 Peter 3, 3 through 6. This is Peter talking. "Let your beauty not be external, the braidings of your hair and wearing of gold, jewelry, or fine clothes, but the inner person of your heart, the lasting beauty of a gentle and tranquil spirit, which is precious in the sight of God. For in the same way the holy women who hoped in God long ago adorned themselves to being subject to their husbands, like Sarah, who obeyed Abraham, calling him Lord. You become her children when you do what is good and have no fear of doing so." So the Bible, gives honor to Sarah in many different ways. And I think the other thing to take note here is that Sarah died in the promised land, right? So it was a long journey, a long struggle with her and her husband, Abraham. They had a lot of challenges. They made a lot of screw-ups along the way. We talked about some of those. Even she herself did some not so great things, both in the eyes of God and the eyes of man. But you know what? This is such a great example of how God uses people just like you and me, right? So often we have the tendency to look at those in the Bible and say how much more spiritual they were and so much more they knew and how much more they were honoring of God. But this is such a really good example of someone who made a lot of mistakes, and God's given her great honor. And she lived to see that promise fulfilled. So Abraham mourns the passing of his wife. He felt, unbelievable sorrow, and he wasn't afraid to show it. He wasn't afraid to mourn. And, I think so much in Western culture. This is something that men have to be manly men, right? We can't show our weaknesses in that way. And it was a tradition in Jewish culture how they mourned. There's a lot we could spend the whole night talking about, but ways that the Bible talks about people mourning, tearing their clothes, sitting on the ground, wailing and lamenting, shaving their heads, cutting their hair, sackcloth and ashes. And we know that Abraham he lost his life partner, and that's tough. That's rough. Anyone who's lost anyone knows that's tough. But he mourned deeply. And this is another really really interesting fact. Out of this whole chapter, only 2 verses deal with Sarah's death and Abraham's grief. And the other 18 are all about the negotiation, right, for the land. There's some meaning in there. We're gonna dig a little bit into that, but just think about that in the context of their journey. Where they came. As we've been reading. Chapter after chapter after chapter, the things that they've been through, the struggles that they've been through, times when they were faithful, times where they were not. And you get to the climax of them coming into the promised land and all this stuff, and then Sarah passes away, and we get 1 verse for her, 1 verse for Abraham mourning, and the rest is we're going to negotiate for this land. Interesting, very interesting. I have some questions there you guys can ponder when we break down into groups. Let's move on to verses 3 through 9. Then Abraham got up from mourning his dead wife and said to the son, I better put my glasses on. That struggle's just going on too long. And he said to the sons of Heth, I am a foreign resident, a temporary settler among you. Grant me ownership of a burial site among you, so that I may bury my dead. The sons of Heth answered Abraham, Listen, sir, you are a mighty prince among us. You may bury your dead in the choicest of our tombs. None of us will refuse you his tomb to prevent you from burying your dead. Abraham got up and bowed down to the local people, the sons of Heth. He said to them, If you agree that I may bury my dead, then hear me out. Ask Ephron, the son of Zohar, if he will sell me the cave of Machpelah that belongs to him. It is at the end of the field. Let him sell it to me publicly for the full price, so that I may own it as a burial site. Now, there's a lot of stuff loaded in there. The first thing that really jumped out to me was that, Abraham wasn't really talking about this promised land not being his home. He was talking more or less about this earth not being my home. He recognized that he was temporary. He was a sojourner here in this land, and heaven was his destination of what God had for him. Moses knew the same thing and commanded Israel to know it in Leviticus 25:23. You can look that up on your own. David also knew it. 1 Chronicles 29:14 through 15, and in Psalm 39:12. What I really like here, though, is how they looked upon him with such favor and influence. I mean, those words, that came out of their mouth, listen, sir, you are a mighty prince among us. And they were showing him the honor and the favor that came along with that. And that's something that to me, that God deposited in him So when people were around him, they just knew. They knew that this is a man basically covered in the grace of God and doing the things of God. And isn't that us, right? I mean, when we talk about, favor and influence, when God's favor is on us, I don't know if you've ever been in situations where things kind of went in the direction that you wanted them to, or the direction that God was calling you to, and they just went in that direction, and they shouldn't have gone that way. It just shouldn't have happened that way. But it did, because God's favor was on you. There had been times, in my life where I almost looked at situations and said, boy, it's just not even fair, because I feel God's favor on me in this situation so strongly. And the influence that we can have in culture and in society and in dealings with God's favor on us. I mean, we should really, the presence of God and the kingdom that's within us. I mean, Jesus said the kingdom is within us, and we need to release that and take that. Anytime we are involved in anything, whether it's, a negotiation like here where Abraham was, or if we walk into the midst of a dispute, or if we walk into, for me, in business, if I am, in a group of people, the presence of God should change the atmosphere in that situation. If I am truly releasing that kingdom and the Holy Spirit, the atmosphere should change, and that's exactly what happened here with Abraham. And maybe it was. How do we look at that? How do we interpret that? Is that the privilege of being God's children? Well, that's a really bad word today. We don't use that word privilege, right? Because being privileged is not a good thing. But of course it was. It was here. Joseph knew that favor. Genesis 39, 3-4, we're going to get there. Moses knew that favor and that influence that God had put on him. David did, Ruth did, Samuel did, Esther did, Daniel did, Mary. All throughout the Bible, there are examples of people who walked in the favor of God and had that influence that went with it. And this is just one example of that happening. So let's move on again, verses 10 through 16. Now Ephron was sitting among the sons of Heth. Ephron the Hittite replied to Abraham in the hearing of the sons of Heth before all who entered the gate of this city, "No, my lord, hear me out. I sell you both the field and the cave that is in it. In the presence of my people, I sell it to you. Bury your dead." Abraham bowed before the local people and said to Ephron in their hearing, "Hear me, if you will. I pay you the price for the field. Take it from me, that I may bury my dead wife." And Ephron answered Abraham, saying to him, "Hear me, my lord. The land is worth 400 pieces of silver. But what is that between me and you? So bury your dead." So Abraham agreed to Ephron's price and weighed out for him the price that Ephron had quoted in the hearing of the sons of Heth, 400 pieces of silver according to the standard measurement at the time. And this is really kind of a really beautiful back and forth. And I don't know how many of you have been involved in negotiations before, but it's not typically the way a negotiation's supposed to go, right? I'm supposed to Someone's supposed to make me an offer, and I'm going to counter that offer, and they're going to counter, and we're going to meet somewhere in between, right? That's how every good negotiation works. Someone is asking $100, we should meet kind of halfway. Well, not in the housing market today, I guess, but good negotiations, that's the art of the negotiation, right? So if you've negotiated anything, this is not really how a negotiation's supposed to go. This was an awesome kind of back and forth. And this bargaining, too, this negotiating was and is typical in Middle Eastern culture. I'm sure Danny can affirm that negotiating is just kind of part of the culture over in the Middle East. And Abraham showed how a follower of God should conduct business with the world. He was courteous, fair, prudent, and not giving a counter offer. Abraham was remarkably generous in his dealings. He showed character and principle and generosity, and I really believe that God blesses that when we are able to do that. And when we can bless others in a situation like that, God will return that to us in countless ways. He'll multiply that back to us. And I really believe that that's true. And I think that that's a principle that Abraham was practicing here. It was just beautifully done. And it's hard, for me. It's gotten a lot easier the older that I've gotten. But when I was younger, it's hard to go into a negotiation and think of the other party, right? Because I'm trying to look out for my welfare and money and what's best for me or what's best for my business and all of this. So it was harder when I was younger to really understand this principle of God, this principle of reaping and sowing. But the older that I got, and over time as I saw God in action with this, how he would multiply things in my life when I gave without expectation. And when I was looking out for others, for their benefit and for their welfare, and to make sure that they're being treated fairly in a deal, God began to bless that and teach me that principle. And that is a kingdom principle that's from the beginning of the Bible to the end of the Bible, that as we give with a grateful heart, that as we give and when we look to the benefit and the welfare of others, God will multiply that back to me. The other thing that I pulled out of this was, refusing to receive this plot of land without cost also displayed the great value that he put in his wife, Sarah. This is something worth paying for. I want to invest in this for, at the time, I'm sure he was feeling just for his wife. And I think that how we conduct ourselves in not just business deals, because not everybody here is in business, but in daily transactions with people is a reflection of our relationship with Christ. It's a reflection of how much faith we have in him, how much we believe in him, and how much we can live out what we have. And it's one of those things that just, it's kind of hard at first. Just like when you're young, it's kind of hard to tithe. Oh man, it just kind of hurts to give up that money because I really need it. I got to pay this bill. I got to pay that bill. I got to pay that bill. And as God, over time, as we begin to kind of release and give that freely, it's an opportunity to give. I started out this year And I said to myself, I'm not going to miss an opportunity to be generous this year. I'm not going to walk away from an opportunity to be generous. And lo and behold, in January, a couple weeks later, I was stopping for my morning coffee at Backyard Beans. And I come walking out, and, a guy, a homeless guy says, hey, can I have a few bucks for this? And I didn't have my wallet with me. I said, I don't have my wallet with me. But I knew I probably had like $5 or $10 or something in my console if I would have dug through it, and I was kind of running late, and I just took off. And as soon as I left, I said, God just immediately spoke to me and said, you missed an opportunity. and that's what it was. It was an opportunity to give and to bless. And I went back and I looked for that guy like at least half a dozen times, and I didn't find him. And you know who lost in that situation? Me. That's who lost. I lost. So this is such a great example of Abraham, showing his gracefulness, showing his character, letting God be a reflection of that in him. And I think that how we conduct ourselves in these things, and how we show generosity, and how we're willing to trust God in these situations is really a reflection of God in us. So let's keep moving here. Verses 17 to 20. So Abraham secured Ephron's field in Machpelah next to Mamre, including the field, the cave that was in it, and all the trees that were in the field and all around the border, as the property in the presence of the sons of Heth before all who entered the gates of Ephron city. After this, Abraham buried his wife Sarah in the cave in the field of Machpelah near Mamre, that is Hebron, the land of Canaan, the promised land. So Abraham secured the field and the cave, and that was the burial site from the sons of Heth. So there's multiple emphases here that Abraham secured the land. In fact, that it was legal and it was binding and that there was a deed. So question in your groups is, why the emphasis on that? Because there's got to be a meaning, because, did he really need more than what God had promised? So this statement is basically overemphasizing the fact that Abraham now legally owns this field. The repetition means something. And in his mind, he was feeling that he was doing this for his wife, Sarah. But in reality, this is where Isaac and Ishmael buried Abraham. Isaac and Rebekah were both buried here. Jacob buried Leah here. Joseph buried Jacob here. The cave of Machpelah near Hebron was the great tomb of the patriarchs. Interesting, right? So some takeaways here. I always like to kind of reflect and say, okay, what is our main takeaways? What is our main theme here? Abraham's response in this situation, there was, the realism of dealing with the death of his wife. That's just a real thing. And I think that, as if any of you have experienced the death of someone close to you, you know what that's like, and you know what he was going through. So it was, realism and faith, in action, kind of working together. The other takeaway is that, dealing with death is a part of life, and it's a part of faith. I've seen death, drive people away from God, and I've seen death drive people towards God. And it's really a choice of how we're going to embrace that. And Abraham was one who modeled that for us. Abraham and Sarah lived to see God's promise, the promised land, multiple promises, the promise of Isaac. They lived to see this. That's not always the case, is it? We don't always see the fruition of God's promises. But I think this is an example for us to look to and say, God is a God of promise, whether we see it with our own eyes or not. God is a God that fulfills his promises. And when you look at the promise, what he promised Abraham favor, blessing, land, and descendants. And did he deliver on all of those? He did. He did. In a big way, he did. And the last thing that was just a big takeaway for me is that people should see a distinctive difference in how believers deal with things. They should see it. They should notice. They should stand up and say, there's something different about that, because God's favor should be on us. God's kingdom, God's spirit should be around us. The atmosphere should change in these situations, and people should see that. It should be evident in our lives. So that's it. Quick wrap, and I gave you guys some questions. Obviously, like I always say, not all the questions. If you have questions of your own that you want to interject, but I would encourage you to, wrestle amongst yourselves with some of these things. Like, why are these details in there? Why are some of these things mentioned? God doesn't ever just randomly mention things. There's always meaning to them. And try to relate to these and talk about amongst yourself, have there been situations, when you reacted similar, or when you reacted, negatively, and you should have done it a different way. All right? So, how do we go? 2, 4, 6, 10, 12. We got 14. Should we do, I don't know, 3 groups? 2 groups? What's the consensus? What do you guys think? Should we half the room, or should we do 3? Half the room. Let's half the room. 2, 3, 6. Yeah, that's perfect. All right. 7. All right. It's a good number. Let's break.